One of Canada's top political journalists just left the legacy media. Today, we're joined by Paul Wells to talk about his new venture into the world of independent media. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. So this week we learned that Canada's most prominent political writer and journalist, Paul Wells, my guest on the podcast today, will not be joining another big corporate media outlet. Instead, he's launched his own Substack called Paul Wells, where you can directly subscribe to his content and consume his political writing. In mid-March, Paul announced that he was leaving Maclean's magazine, where he had written on and off for 20 years. And we just learned today that he is gone independent. So Paul Wells is one of Canada's leading political journalists. He's been a political journalist in Ottawa for 28 years before making this jump into independent media. He was a columnist over at Maclean's. He's also written for the Toronto Star, National Post, and Montreal Gazette. Wells is a 3-time gold recipient of the National Magazine Award, the John W. Defoe Book Prize winner, and the Shaughnessy Cohen Book Prize for Political Writing. He moderated the federal debates in 2015 and 2019. And in addition to being a print journalist, he's hosted Maclean's Live. He has interviewed just about every major political and cultural figure in Canada. And for a time, he was a member of the At Issue panel over on CBC. So Paul, it's such an honor to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Candice. Thanks for asking me.
Okay, so I know you've been a political journalist for 28 years in Ottawa, you tell me. And I'm just wondering, before we get into your foray here into independent media and your Substack, what got you into journalism in the first place? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what reporting and what journalism looked like back then and how it's changed over the years.
So in the very earliest incarnation, and this goes back further into the 20th century than I like to contemplate, I started writing for my campus newspaper at Western because a friend of mine was taking photographs for the Western Gazette. And he said that if you take pictures of a concert or review a concert, you can get in for free. And the great jazz trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie was coming to Western, and I didn't want to spend $17 on a ticket. So I went and offered to review it. And fortunately, nobody else ever wants to write about jazz. So that was my first piece for the Gazette. I'm shy by nature. Journalism allows you to go where the action is and ask rude questions. And there was no other way in life that I was going to get to do that. And so that's really what the appeal was. You go to places where fascinating and sometimes terrifying things are happening, and you indulge your curiosity and you explain it to people, and then you try and put it in context. And so from the Western Gazette, I went to the Montreal Gazette. They sent me to Ottawa. And I've somehow never left.
Interesting. And so maybe you can walk us through how the industry has changed over the years. You know that us here at True North have been very critical of the Trudeau government's meddling and the funding bailouts and the new legislation. I'm wondering from your perspective, though, how has media changed? How has it stayed the same? And what sort of led you to choose to leave Maclean's and go independent?
Okay. You'll agree, Candice, that there are issues that you and I don't agree on, but I've also been very critical of the government attempts to subsidize news production. I think all it does is it opens us up to allegations of not being impartial, of being bought out. And you can debate those allegations all day long, but the fact is news organizations are getting money from the government. And, it responds to, that wrong-headed policy responds to an obvious and objective truth, which is that there's less money in journalism than there used to be. When I started, again, in the 80s, at the end of the 80s, if you lived in Montreal and you wanted to sell a chest of drawers or a bicycle or a futon, or you had a truck and you were willing to hire it out to drive stuff around, you had to take out a classified ad in the Montreal Gazette. There was no other way to let people know what was going on. And so the Gazette had thousands and thousands of ads every day, many, many pages of classified ads and car ads and cinema ads and so on. And therefore it was sitting on a stack of money. And similarly, because this is before the internet, if you wanted to know what got said in Parliament yesterday, or what the Prime Minister said at his fundraiser last night, or who's playing at the music clubs tonight. You had to pick up a newspaper. You didn't have an independent way of doing it. And so that the fact that we lived at the crossroads between people who needed to sell and people who needed to know gave us extraordinary power. And as a result, kind of a middling regional paper like the Montreal Gazette in those days had 3 people in their Ottawa bureau, 2 reporters at City Hall, a theater critic, a food writer, just a kind of an opulent offering of journalism. And over the years, that all stopped. Gazette went from having 3 reporters in Ottawa to not having any, from having 2 reporters at the courthouse to not having any, and smaller organizations have closed altogether or are struggling mightily. And finally, at some point, in my own case, in my own shop, I decided I didn't want to work at my old shop. And then it was feasible for me to just hang out my own shingle and at least aspire. We're in very early stages yet, but I can at least aspire to make a decent living at it.
Interesting. And so what was it specifically about Substack? I assume that when you left Macleans and you wrote that you did an interview with Hill Times saying you left Macleans because there's new corporate owners and you didn't really see eye to eye with their management style. Was your initial decision to, I'm going to go on, do a Substack, I'm going to kind of follow what Barry Weiss has done very successfully down in the US and so many others? Or were you kind of on the fence? When did you decide to take the plunge and go independent? And what was the sort of main motivating factor there?
So I left Maclean's 5 weeks ago. And it's pointless to litigate why. The new owners of Maclean's are taking it in a different direction. I thought they were doing it clumsily, and I figured life is too short to hang out with people who aren't fun to work with. So, but when I quit, I had no idea what I was going to do next. I'm now at the age where friends of mine who are teachers are starting to retire. So I thought maybe I'll just stop working. I looked around for some corporate gig outside of journalism, and A, there were not a lot of offers. B, none of them sounded fun. And then in journalism, I could work as a freelancer. I've written a half dozen pieces in a month for a bunch of organizations. But I figured at some point, editors would get tired of me calling. The same thing would happen that has happened to other freelancers. I could, petition one of the big news organizations to hire me full time. But for 20 years, people have been saying, Paul, why don't you just go out on your own? 20 years ago, people were saying you could just write a blog and then, hold out a tip jar and people will give you money if they want. And frankly, I found that terrifying. But the Substack platform makes it super easy for people to pay if they want. It makes it really easy for journalists to organize and to decide, what they want to charge for, what they want to distribute for free. It's sort of like Shopify for journalism. It takes care of all of the back office plumbing that I'm really not good at, and it leaves the journalist free to write. And so I thought I would give it a shot. And first day has been very encouraging.
Well, it is sort of a scary thing to go out on your own, and especially to start a business, which is essentially what you're doing. So certainly applaud the entrepreneurship. It's interesting you talk about the early days of media and the fact that you needed to go to these outlets in order to get information. We live in a world now where all of that information is at your fingertips in 1,000 different places. And so you don't really need these intermediaries as much. And there's definite pros and cons about that. The cons is that you lose, a lot of the local flavor. Like you don't have, like you said, a courtroom reporter or a local reporter, holding City Hall and the mayor accountable. Whereas, a large prominent voice like yours, Paul Paul Wells, everyone knows it. I'm sure you're going to get flooded with subscribers. Do you think that there's room on the platform, that there's still space for that sort of local reporting, or do you think that that's going to be one of the big casualties of this change to online media world?
I always thought, I mean, back when it was just blogging, back when there were 1,000 people in Canada who were doing blogs more or less for free, I thought that this would allow for blossoming of local reporting. Someone who's just interested or mad at City Hall and won't let go of that. And it really hasn't panned out that way. There's a few people, Joey Coleman, who runs an independent news organization in Hamilton, and is far and away the toughest observer of how the city government in Hamilton works. He's been able to make a go of it. But there aren't a lot of other examples. And I do think local journalism suffers because local audiences are usually not big enough to support, a single entrepreneur. We talk about the federal subsidies to news organizations. I mean, I worry about the health of journalism in this country, but I think that there are some cures that are at least arguably worse than the disease. And I don't think the federal government's efforts to help much.
Well, you've written quite a bit about that, Paul, and I know Justin Trudeau's preference seems to be to just subsidize everything, right? I've talked about this on my show in the past, but in 2015 he pledged all this money to the CBC to make up for cuts that the Harper government had made during their draft deficit reduction action plan. He promised them much more. The CBC used the money to create an online news outlet, essentially, where everyone could get the news for free. And then at the same time, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, National Post are trying to compete in the world of getting subscriptions and creating a paywall. And so, rather than taking a look at his initial subsidy, he just chose to sprinkle the subsidies everywhere and start paying newsrooms to do their news. I want to sort of ask you, how do you think that's changed the media landscape in the last 2 years since he's introduced this program?
What it hasn't done has been to make a lot of conspicuously healthier news organizations, like the big old line news organizations, the ones where I've spent my career, are not further from death's door after a couple of years of these subsidy programs. There's something called the local journalism initiative, which is an effort to chip in money for people who work in places that wouldn't ordinarily get many journalists. So Le Devoir has a reporter who writes in French about what happens in small town Ontario, and that's government money. And I can't get really angry about that. But I think that the amount of money the feds have put in is not really enough to help us do our work on a large scale, but it's absolutely enough to shatter our credibility with some of our readership and some of our audiences. And when someone now, the nice thing is I'm not going to be getting any federal money at Substack. I can't be bought and paid for except by my readers. And I didn't think I was bought and paid for before. Actually, Macleans didn't, as a magazine, didn't qualify for a lot of these new programs. We qualified for a program that James Moore used to run when he was the Conservative Minister of Heritage, just as his Liberal successors have run it. But when someone says you're in the tank of the government, after all, they're paying part of your paycheck, I had no rebuttal. I know how I feel. I know I believe my journalism to be entirely credible. But what am I going to say? We're not getting federal money? Well, yes, we were. That's not the sort of thing, that's not the very essence of a conflict of interest. Any definition of conflict of interest I've ever seen says it doesn't matter whether your work is corrupted. What matters is whether an observer could reasonably wonder whether your work is corrupted. And like I say, I have no rebuttal to those claims.
Well, and I think a lot of people who would be critical of these government subsidies, myself included, would say that it wouldn't necessarily always be the local journalist on the ground, although they might have that idea in the back of their head, especially during an election, when you have two parties and one is promising more money for your organization, one's promising less. But the idea that sort of higher ups, the corporate executives are choosing, which overall storylines to kill and chase, and where to do your research and where to do the ATIPs, and those are where the conflicts may take place. It's hard to argue against that when there's lobbying campaigns being done to try to ensure places like Google and Facebook pay their what's called fair share. They're openly doing advocacy and then turning around and calling groups like True North activists when we're not running full page ads on our website promoting one government policy or another. So let's go. Let's talk about your new website, your Substack called Paul Wells. Can you tell us about your first scoop, which is this mysterious $15 billion billion?
I just happen to have the URL right here.
There you go.
Substack.com. That was from a previous call. It's pretty thin right now. As we speak, there's one piece on the site. It's about a big ticket item in last week's federal budget, something called the Canada Growth Plan, which is a fund of $15 billion that will invest in green technology, and actually it'll invest in quite a wide variety of things. And the idea is that it'll attract $3 from outside institutional investors, basically pension funds, for every dollar that it spends. There's a couple problems, and basically my piece amounts to a bunch of questions about that. First of all, it's really not clear to me how it's going to be $15 billion. When you look in the columns of the budget, it's only $1.5 billion. And they say that money comes from savings elsewhere, which they don't specify, so that in effect, this $15 billion fund won't cost anything. This is because of essentially an accounting technique where they say the only money that's going to get spent is the essentially bargain rate they're going to charge on interest rates. So they're going to offer loans. They're going to charge less than prime to these big pension funds, and so they're going to make back about 90 cents on the dollar. First of all, I don't believe any of that. I believe they honestly hope that that's the way it's going to work. But the thing is, when you're offering concessions on huge loans in a complex environment on edgy new technology, I don't see how you can have any idea who's going to be investing 3 or 4 or 8 years out, and how likely they're going to be able to pay you back. And then the other thing I wonder is, I just have a bunch of questions about how it's going to work. And the reason I peck away at this is I think governments get themselves in trouble when they announce solutions to complex problems that just aren't going to work. I think that undermines trust in government. And as someone who thinks that government can be a force for good, I would really like people to stop making false promises on its behalf.
Well, one of the things the Trudeau government seems to love to do is put out big round numbers and then claim that they, like you said, have the solution to complex problems. So it seems to me that words like innovation and Canada Growth Fund, those are kind of buzzwords that the government loves to put out there. And of course, it's not just Trudeau and Freeland. We see this provincially. We saw this in Ontario with the Wynne government, where they would love to announce that they were partnering with Google and a new building in Waterloo or whatever. And it's like, what is it that a government, like why would the government want to get involved in subsidizing big tech companies, or why what specifically would a Canada Growth Fund do to attract investment, aside from, again, just going the route of subsidies? Personally, as a conservative, I would like to see just a more competitive work environment, less regulations, lower taxes across the board, more predictability from the government as opposed to these schemes. Why is it that you think that Trudeau goes for these schemes, and do you think that they will be successful. I mean, you look at Canada's growth rate right now, or GDP growth, I think we're lagging last in the G7. Our economy doesn't seem to be as robust as it ought to be. It doesn't seem like these kind of growth funds really work from my perspective. I'm wondering what you think about it.
Well, so we can kind of saw it off, and instead of, or at least in addition to debating back and forth whether these things work or not, we could hope for governments that instead of constantly only announcing what's going to happen, they sometimes report on what did happen. So, for a while there was this trend about deliverology, which everybody made fun of because deliverology was a made-up name that sounded silly. But it was the idea that instead of getting excited about announcements, about inputs, how much money are we spending on this, you would track results. You would, so if you hope to influence infant birth weight, because low birth weight children have often a difficult future ahead of them, you would simply report on infant birth weight over time. And if you're worried about mercury in water, you would just report on the rate of mercury in water. And if you're trying to attract, and for goodness sake, if you're trying to attract a global investment into Canadian technology projects, you should report at regular intervals about how much investment you've attracted. Because this new Canada Growth Fund is plainly modeled after the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which was going to build roads and ports and bridges and irrigation systems with, a fair amount of federal money, and then a bunch of investment from these international pension funds. And with a team of bloodhounds, if you went to the Canada Infrastructure Bank website today, you could not find how much extra private investment they've managed to attract to go along with these federal dollars. Because the answer is it hasn't worked. Or it hasn't worked very well. Or it's sometimes worked and sometimes not. And I know that's embarrassing, but if you report on results instead of on inputs, then everyone can see how well things are going. And maybe some people would come up with a better idea. And what you certainly wouldn't do is clone a flawed model, hoping that people wouldn't notice that it didn't work. It didn't work great the last time, and therefore its odds of working. I'm all about a higher level of accountability than what we have, and that's why it was a pretty risky proposition. I'm starting a newsletter that I hope a lot of people are going to be interested in, and the first piece is this pretty wonky deep dive into the fiscal tables in the last budget. But I've been doing that for a long time. And because a lot of my colleagues don't have the luxury of working at that level of detail, they don't have curiosity about it. And frankly, successful governments hope that their work won't be scrutinized at that level, because it's easier to just kind of surf on vague impressions.
Well, that's what the Trudeau government is very good at, is pithy one-liners and platitudes, not so much the details. I find personally the whole budget process to just be numbingly just out of touch, because you expect a budget to be line item, this is what we're spending the money on. But instead, what you get, and I've been in those budget lockups before, where they give the budget out to journalists and stakeholders a couple hours before it gets released publicly. And what you're looking at is like a 500-page marketing material book with all the government, buzzwords and promoting their own stuff. And you really have to dig deep to get to some of the details. So I think a lot of people appreciate you doing a deep dive, even though it might not be the most glamorous subject for your first blog post. But I want to ask you about another piece that you wrote a couple months ago, over at Maclean's in November. You described Trudeau's handling of COVID as twisting the spending knob to 11 and the accountability knob to 0. You questioned whether he would use a similar approach to his other pet issues, naming climate change and housing. Well, this latest budget, we sort of saw a little bit like that. So it's almost like you predicted this budget in the future. Do you think that this is the legacy that Justin Trudeau had in mind for himself during his time as Prime Minister?
Oh, probably not. I got to say, probably the accountability knob probably hasn't been turned to zero. It's lower than I want to be, and I'm always trying to force it up. A couple of examples. You quoted growth over the next several years is projected to be lower in Canada than in the rest of the G7. Amazingly, we can find that piece of information in the latest budget. And there's also a thing that total spending on research and development has been declining in Canada, and it's the only G7 country where that's been happening. I was honestly amazed that they admit these two things in the budget. I think that's some people are starting to say, look, we've been here for almost 7 years and the results aren't great. And so they kind of snuck that stuff into the budget. You ask about whether this is the legacy that Trudeau wanted. I keep coming back to a speech that he gave in 2014, the beginning of 2014, in Montreal at the last Liberal Party convention before the 2015 election. And what he said is, if governments can't demonstrate that their efforts work for regular people, then people are going to start to look around for other alternatives. He described them as extreme alternatives. I think he was right about that. I think if you know, the mainstream parties, the Christian Democrats in Germany, the Liberals and Conservative Party in Canada, you know, you could go around the circle. The Labour and the Tories and the the Liberal Democrats in the UK. If they can't show that the work they do makes sense to people and has an effect on their life and helps them, then you're going to start to see people considering other alternatives. And just my temperament, I'm not the guy who's going to say, you should consider those extreme alternatives. I'm going to be the guy who reminds the brokerage parties, the traditional parties, you have a responsibility. You can't make wild promises you can't fulfill. You can't make wild claims that aren't backed up. You can't hose money around if it doesn't help. Because just as Justin Trudeau said, you're undermining the case for a politics of consensus. And I don't think that's healthy.
And I'm not trying to pick on you here, Paul, but it seems to me that there are a lot of voices in the media, a lot of pundits, a lot of columnists who are very quick to do just what you described to conservatives, to say, you know, these conservatives are doing dog whistle politics, they're playing into populism, look at these horrible truckers. And I know you wrote a little bit about the truckers. It doesn't seem like you were a big fan of them, but at the same time, you didn't seem to support Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergency Act. It seems like there's a willingness to hold the Conservatives to account for things that they say that journalists think have crossed the line, but not so much when it comes to Trudeau and the Liberals. I'll give you an example. During the last election, he referred to the unvaccinated. He said that they're usually racist, misogynistic, people who don't believe in science. Really, we saw villainization, demonization of people who, for whatever reason, maybe it was because of a medical choice or just because they had already had COVID and they had natural immunity. We saw real villainization of people by this prime minister. And I didn't see a lot of journalists really jumping to hold him to account for that. I'm wondering your perspective on that.
Boy, there's a lot in there. I've had some good conversations with people who were in that convoy. I spoke to grain farmers of Ontario in London, Ontario, a few weeks ago, and some of the guys there had been in the convoy. And we had such an exchange that after it was over, we went out in the hallway afterwards and talked for another hour. I didn't like the convoy. I didn't like the center of a major Canadian city getting shut down for weeks on end. Neither do I like politics that are designed to push substantial segments of society into a corner and delegitimize the way they think about things. And I think I'm for a politics that tries to reconcile the apparent contradictions there. Um, there were members of the leadership of the Freedom Convoy whose Facebook accounts, social media posts expressed at length sentiments that I would consider were racist. I don't, but neither do I think that that's an appropriate blanket description of everyone who was there, or everyone who was supporting them, or everyone who, as some of the polling showed, shares the frustrations with the restrictions that we've all had to go through. And so, and look, I mean, Candice, I don't share all of your politics. You don't share all of mine. You invited me on to talk about the work that I do, and I appreciated the invitation. I'd rather have a conversation than not have a conversation. And I think that instinct to say, you have a bad take, therefore I'm going to rat on you to your, like the stuff we see on Twitter every day. I'm going to rat you out to your boss because I disagree with what you just said. Or I'm going to get all of my friends to declare that we're going to stop paying attention to you. I mean, I try to avoid cliches, so I don't like the term cancel culture, but I think we've gotten to a place as a country where we need to encourage ourselves to have more conversations with people who think differently, rather than barricading ourselves with the people who agree with us about everything. I think that latter impulse, it might be understandable, but it's not producing good results.
I saw you had a guest op-ed in the National Post not too long ago, talking about how you liked working for the Post back in the day because there was so much freedom and everyone always disagreed with each other. And that was part of the fun of the National Post, whereas now it seems that people get really upset when they read opinions that they don't like, and there's this sort of change in mood and culture. And you wrote that it felt like political correctness was coming back. From my perspective, it seems like political correctness never went away. It's just now it's on steroids, and the amount of conversation, the topics that you're allowed to have has gotten a lot more narrow when it comes to the sort of mainstream acceptable society. What do you think the remedy to that is?
It's funny, I just gave a talk to another group about trust, and I said, we have to think about who the subject and the object is in conversations about trust. And instead of wondering, why don't people trust me, or why don't people accept what I have to say at face value, we should remember that we're the subject in the question. The question is, do I trust other people? Do I take the leap of faith to believe that maybe they are speaking in good faith and looking for solutions rather than just being annoying to me? And am I trustworthy? Is my own work honest, based on fact, expressed in a way that isn't looking for a fight, but is looking for a response in a conversation? And I can't control what anyone else does. I left Twitter because I didn't like most of what I was seeing on Twitter. The only thing I'm captain of my soul or something. The only thing I've got sovereignty over is my own reactions. So I try and produce work that I try and produce work that I believe in, that I think people will find is worth their time. And I lean hard on limiting the natural response to say, man, to hell with you if you don't agree with me. We've all had a tough couple of years. I have been amazed at the way some people have responded to a virus that's too dumb to know what side of the debate it's supposed to be on. And I get that we're all tired, but I don't think I improve things by playing appropriateness cop. That just seems like a bit of a lame response.
Absolutely. I agree that, everyone seems to be, tightly wound up these days, and there's a lot of tension. And I think that we would be all very advised to, your style of journalism and writing is always sort of the cool, calm, collected afterthought, the sober afterthought, as opposed to the hot takes on Twitter. I was wondering, I'm going to ask you, now that you're going independent and you need to promote your Substack, are you planning on coming back onto Twitter, or are you still on a Twitter hiatus?
No, my wife asked me about that this morning, and I said, no, I'm going to stay off. I'm going to stay off Twitter. I'm going to test some of the assumptions about the newsletter life. I'm not going to claim that some mob of wrong-thinking people is out to get me. I'm not going to try and sharpen points of dispute. I'm going to, like this piece I wrote this morning that is, opens the path to uncomfortable questions, but doesn't make sort of blanket allegations or claims. I'm going to see how much of that stuff I can do. I mean, now look, I've got an advantage a lot of people don't have, which is that I've built a large audience over the years. But we both know people who are happy to, stride into battle every day. I'm gonna see if it's possible to make it work with a different style.
Well, that's great, Paul. I think that there's so many Canadians out there that are happy to see your writing again, happy to see that there's a place where they can find your work on a regular basis. And we're all looking forward to the work that you do. I know that there's probably some members of the Trudeau government that are not so thrilled with the fact that you're doing this, because hopefully you'll be holding them to account in a way that is duly needed. So I thank you for your time. Appreciate you coming on. I know, like you said, we don't always agree, but it's just nice to hear your perspective, and we wish you all the best in your Substack.
Thanks for the invitation.
All right, that's Paul Wells. You can find his Substack over at Paul Wells. Sorry, let me just get that right. It's substack.paulwells.com, right?
It's paulwells.substack.com.
Okay, I'll let Paul hold up his URL there. So paulwells.substack.com. Go check it out. Go subscribe. Go support independent journalism. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.